We are privileged to have as the Burns Library Visiting Scholar this academic year a distinguished historian, Dr. Maria Luddy, Professor of History at the University of Warwick. Dr. Luddy holds the doctorate in history from the University College Cork and has been a faculty member at Warwick since 1990. Previously, she was a lecturer in history at the University of Limerick. Professor Luddy specializes in the social and political history of 19th and 20th century Ireland, with a concentration on the history of women. She served as director of the Women's History Project based in Dublin from 1997 to 2001, and she has written extensively on the role of women in modern Irish history. She was a joint editor of the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, Volumes 5 and 4, and Women's Writing and Traditions. She co-edited Women Surviving, Studies in Irish Women's History in the 19th and 20th centuries, and Women, Power, and Consciousness in 19th Century Ireland, 8 biographical studies. In 1995, Cambridge University Press published her award-winning work, Women and Philanthropy in 19th Century Ireland. Recent books include the Crimean Journals of Sisters of Mercy, 1854 to 1856, and Women in 20th Century Ireland, a documentary history to be published in 2006 by Cork University Press. She has written numerous articles. Maria's talk this afternoon is entitled Locating Irish Women's History by Getting Lost in the Archives, or Where Are All the Women in Irish History? Maria?
Thank you, Bob. Can everybody hear me? Yes. First apology, I'm not sure my voice is going to hold out, so I am maybe coughing a little bit, but I have water here, so apologies for that in advance. Secondly, I am actually honoured to have been chosen as a Burns Library Scholar for this academic year, and I've been here since September, and I can't believe that the first semester is almost over. The time's gone so quickly, so I must be enjoying myself. What I really want to talk about is I suppose mostly the Women's History Project that I was involved in. When I began to research Irish women's history in the mid-1980s, it was thought, I suppose, it was thought impossible that any comprehensive history of women could be written for Irish women. It was believed quite widely that such sources for this kind of history, for any aspect of Irish women's history, literally did not exist. And indeed, when I thought of doing my PhD on women and philanthropy in 19th century Ireland, I got 2 responses. The first was from an acquaintance of mine who asked who would be interested in women collecting stamps. It'll take a minute. And the second, I could not find a supervisor who would take on the topic because anybody I approached said that the sources didn't exist and the project was actually undoable. I did manage to find a supervisor, and I discovered over 200 charitable societies that were run by lay women, and that was, excluding all the organisations, welfare organisations run by nuns, and I wrote my PhD. So this question of sources seemed to be vital, or at least it was the excuse used for whether Irish women's history was actually accepted as a fit subject for research. Indeed, there was a very famous Irish trade unionist called Louis Bennett, a woman. And there was one biography written of her when I went looking for information on her. I found her in the catalogue of the Rathmines Public Library in Dublin, Louis Bennett, His Life and Times. Okay, so really what I want to do is talk about sources for the history of women in Ireland, and particularly to tell you about the Women's History Project that I was involved in. It was the Women's History Project. It was funded by the Irish government, and it ran from 1997 to 2001, and it had the support of the National Archives of Ireland and the Irish Manuscripts Commission, and indeed we got a lot of money from the Irish government at the time to do the project, and we had 3 main aims. We had to survey and record sources relevant to the history of women in Ireland. We had to list these sources and somehow make this list available to general researchers, the public, anybody who was interested. And we also decided that we were to publish some historical documents relating to the history of women in Ireland. We decided also to look at a series of papers in the National Archives of Ireland, and we choose the Department of Taoiseach papers as representing the most wide-ranging sources of government records about women. And the money for the project was originally agreed by Michael D. Higgins when he was minister, and then he went out of office. There was a new government, and Miss Sheila de Valera actually continued the funding, and we were very grateful to her for that. So I'm going to talk to you about that, and it was actually a very interesting project. And I think in my way of talking about that, you're going to get a whirlwind tour of Irish women's history between the 19th and 20th centuries. But before I go on to the actual archival work that we actually did, I want to talk to you about 3 publications that we published from the project. We published the letters of William Drennan and his sister Martha McTeer, which dated from 1776 to 1819. And we published these in 3 volumes. And this was made possible really by the fact that the 1798 Commemoration Committee was very active at the time and very willing to give money to people who had 1798 projects, and of course William Drennan very much associated with politics of the 1790s. And the interesting thing, of course, is that these Drennan-McTeer letters between William Drennan and his sister Martha had been published before, but they had only been published in a selected edition, and usually the selections were taken on the politics of the period. So they were nearly always the letters of William, extracts from William's letters that were published. We decided to publish the entire collection, which went to 3 volumes and over 1,000 pages. And in fact, if anybody wants to see them, they're actually in the libraries here. But I want to tell you a little bit about them. As I said, the letters have been mostly used for political history of Ireland in the 1790s. But the letters between Martha and William also provide us with direct accounts of their life experiences, their domestic, social and political preoccupations. And indeed, in this very short talk that I'm going to give on them, it is impossible really to do justice to the life that is evident in the correspondence. And as I said, historians have used them very much for the political history of especially the 1790s. However, the letters can be used to deepen our understanding of Irish society generally in this period. We can use these letters to explore the world of domesticity, to investigate the intimacy of marriage and personal relationships, to observe the impact and importance of reading on a woman's life, and to witness the development of political views. We can investigate attitudes to servants, to health, to the profession of medicine, because William himself was a doctor. We can assess also contemporary views on childbirth and children. And nobody had ever used these letters for anything, any of this material before it had ever been used. We can also, of course, look at how Martha and William and their husband and wife respectively actually lived in the society of the time. There were lots of limitations, of course, placed on Martha's life experiences, which resulted from her sex. She lacked access to a sustained formal education and has the privilege of a profession and influence in the public world of politics. But her life was no less full or fulfilled for these limitations. So Martha's and William's letters then were a forum for the exchange of political ideas, family news, gossip, advice, information and feelings. The domestic world of home and family relationships formed the bedrock on which both Martha and William faced the world. The boundaries between the public and the private worlds were not as marked in the 18th century as they were to become in the 19th. The private world of domesticity was still under construction. In Martha and William's worlds, domestic space was filled with servants and visitors. Both Martha and William, singly and when married, were profoundly part of the world of domesticity. They had to manage servants, household budgets, order furniture, and entertain. And it's very interesting to see them buying furniture because they often ship it from Dublin to Belfast, where both of them were born. I mean, William moved around a bit and eventually went to live in Dublin. But when buying furniture in Dublin, instead of obviously, you'd think, oh yeah, they just brought up the Belfast on the roads, whatever. No, they shipped it. It was much cheaper, much easier to ship it from Dublin to Belfast to go by sea. The marriages of Sam, Martha's husband, and Martha herself and William and Sarah were emotionally, intellectually, and physically satisfying. Sam writing to Martha in 1783, when she was nursing William through a serious illness, noted, "Never, my own Mattie, had my affections for you a fairer trial than since I came here, and I find it as strong as ever. Oh, my Mattie, how I do love you. I love Will too, but sometimes you've hurt me by showing too evident a partiality for him. I would not have anyone rival me in your affection, not even Will. For women and men, love, companionship, or attraction were not always the motivations for marriage. Throughout the correspondence, marriages of all types are referred to. Writing to William in December of 1777, Martha told of a recent marriage in Belfast, which she said caused much surprise and diversion. A young lady who has lived all her life in Belfast and of one of the best families in it, but without a fortune. She's married to an old brute of the same place, rich, you may believe, and above 80, a townhouse, country house and carriage, and a number of angry, disappointed relations. The best kind of wife to have, as evidenced in the correspondence, was a sensible one. This implied a wife who would be prudent in her expenses, who would support the endeavours of her husband and care for him and their children. There were men and women who fought, who were violent to each other, vindictive in life and even in death. Daniel Marsden, for instance, died immensely rich, but according to Martha, had fixed a blot on his wife, not undeservedly, by leaving her not a penny beyond her settlement of 100 a year and 2,000 apiece to each of her daughters. There was also the case of Mrs. Atkinson, who had run away to marry a doctor, but was taken mad on her wedding night. There were affairs, divorce, and even murder. Martha was to write to William, informing him that an acquaintance had murdered his wife, for which she observed, there is never any punishment in Belfast. There was also, of course, a deal of fortune hunting, and money often made up what appeared to be physical or even intellectual deficiencies. Lennox Biggar's wife was considered by Martha a fright, ugly and vulgar, and older than her husband. However, she believed that money perhaps makes up for this. One would imagine that few fortune hunters went to the lengths of Mr. Macnaughton, who Martha declared had affected being a fool for years, afterwards faint fits to kill his first wife, by whom he got a pretty fortune. He really succeeded in this, got a second, or rather, I believe, a third wife, with whom he also got some fortune and had more fits. He was a gambler, a man of sense, which she underlines, and a knave. That some sympathy was given to a hard-done by wife is evident from another case observed by Martha, and here we can see her caustic wish. And this is evident in her portrayal of Mrs. Hyde, who had been widowed recently. Mrs. Hyde adopts the same form since her return, for in such a country she will only stay to dispose of her house in town and Cabin Hill, weep in the meeting house, and be affected at the first meeting of each acquaintance who knew she was married to a disgusting tyrant, that to the very last acted as such and left her as little as he could, though certainly in the character of a wife she was for above 30 years perfection. By her father and sister chiefly she has £800 a year and freedom from a brute, so that I think at a convenient time her spirits will recover. So there's just huge amount of information on marriage and servants, on all kinds of things within this correspondence. And just to finish up with one little thing, there's a huge amount of discussion within the letters as well about reading and about books. And one of the books that Martha was certainly familiar with, as were a number of Irish women of this period, were the works of Mary Wollstonecraft. And of course, Wollstonecraft was the author of two very famous works in the 1790s. Her Vindication of the Rights of Man, published in 1790 in response to Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, is less well known than her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was published in 1792 and of course espouses the rights of women. Martha encouraged William to read Wollstonecraft. On the 5th of January 1793 she asked, "Have you read Mrs. Wollstonecraft? I suppose not, or surely you would have mentioned her to me. You ought, even as a politician, and she too conspires to make an important change. I wish," she said, "they would order her book to be burned," because Martha, realizing that to order a book burned would mean that everybody would want to rush out and read it. So she clearly admired and supported Wollstonecraft's ideas. So that was one of the publications that we got out while the project was ongoing. A second publication, which again was kind of interesting, was we published the minutes of the Ulster Unionist Women's Council. And the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was established in 1911, and it attracted an unprecedented number of women into politics. Within a year of its inauguration, the Council was the largest female political organisation Ireland had or has ever seen. There were literally hundreds of thousands of members. It was led by members of Ulster's aristocratic elite, but the Council aimed and succeeded in having both the peeress and the peasant, as they said, represented in its ranks. The Ulster Women's Unionist Council was formed with the primary objective of assisting male unionists to oppose Home Rule for Ireland. And the Ulster Women's Unionist Council became a very significant propaganda machine, very involved in electioneering and fundraising. The Council also worked very closely with the Ulster Volunteer Force, and on the outbreak of the First World War actually became a philanthropic organisation as opposed to a political body, and it sent food and military dressings and parcels from Unionist headquarters in Belfast to the troops at the front. It helped to recruit soldiers to the armed forces and also promoted conscription in Ireland. When the war ended, of course, and with the introduction of votes for women, the political focus of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council did actually change. And as I should say to you as well, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council still exists. And after the First World War, and since then, really, they have been very much involved in propagating the cause of unionism. They don't, unfortunately, do it as successfully as the women in 1911 actually did. I mean, one of the very interesting things about the Ulster Women's Unionist Council minutes is that these are not available. I mean, they are published now. We published them, and they were only available in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And there's absolutely no interest in them as a historical source. We published 500 copies. I think we've still got about 480. Which I think is very, very interesting. It just says a lot about the kinds of things that people are interested in. These are a magnificent source for women's history in Ireland, women's political history. But of course, there are very few people who want to write about unionist women. They're much more interested in nationalist women. And here is just an amazing source, readily available to any student for study of the Ulster Unionist women. The other publication that we actually got out as well, which was really kind of nice. We actually did a collection of photographs of a woman photographer called Eleanor Wiltshire. And these were photographs. She and her husband ran a photographic studio in Dublin in the 40s and 50s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And Eleanor herself was a photographer and went out and took pictures of Dublin, street scenes, street furniture, all kinds of things, people on the Strand and whatever. Absolutely wonderful photographs of kind of everyday life in Dublin in the 40s and the 1960s and 70s. And we had an exhibition of these photographs in 1999, and we published an edition of the photographs in association with the National Library of Ireland, and that has gone into its third printing. So just shows the kind of things people were interested in. The amazing thing about the exhibition when we had it was that people were coming in from Dublin looking at the exhibition and recognizing themselves as children in some of the photographs that were actually displayed. So those were the publications that we actually produced. And so getting back then to the actual archival work, which was a really big part of the project. And I'm not going to say anything bad at all about archivists. And I have to say also that the archivists I'm talking about are Irish archivists we dealt with in Ireland. And archivists I've met here have been absolutely wonderful. All I can say is some archivists in Ireland are very, very strange. But we had our money, we had our managing committee, we had our offices, we had people employed. There were, I was the director, and we had 3 people employed, including myself, at any one time to go around and look at archives. So how do you actually go about organizing such a thing? And all I can say is, if I knew then what I know now, I would never have done it. Okay, and it was wonderful to be so naive about undertaking such a project and not really being sure at all what was available out there. But the first thing we decided to do was to construct a questionnaire and to send the questionnaire out to as many libraries and museums and whatever that we could in Ireland. So we targeted libraries, museums, convents, diocesan archives, hospitals, private individuals, organisations, trade unions, as well as the national repositories such as the National Library of Ireland and the National Archives, as well as the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. We sent out over 500 questionnaires and we got back 50. Right? Now, you might think this is very disappointing, but what happened was that most people got back to us, said they had nothing at all about women in their archives, but that we were welcome to come and have a look if we wanted to. And of course, this is really the answer we wanted. Okay? And others noted there was actually one respondent who apologised that most of their records seemed to deal with men and they had a male archivist, but if we didn't mind, then they would be pleased to have us go through their archives. So he was apologising for the fact that we might have to deal with a male archivist, which never queried that because I'm not sure what people really did think about all of these women going out and looking at archives for women. So we arranged to visit all of these archives that seemed to have material, and we conducted this research over a period of two years. And we actually went and visited, and this is in north of Ireland and the south of Ireland, over 300 repositories throughout the country. And one of the very interesting things that happened in a few archives, and again I must state that in some of these are actually the ones where this occurred were archives that were run or managed by men. And we were always asked to justify what we were doing. What was the value of women's history? Why was the government wasting money on such an enterprise? And after about the first 2 or 3 times that happened, I actually gave up defending the project because I realised that what was happening was that these individuals just needed to rant a little bit about the uselessness of what we were doing. And once they got it out of their system, they actually were usually very helpful and let us roam around the archives and do as we wished. I mean, that was one of the wonderful things, that we had tremendous freedom within the archives to actually look at material that hadn't been catalogued, that nobody'd really gone through for years and years and years. And I mean, we saw material in some terrible conditions. We went into basements, we went into attics. I mean, there was one attic I remember we went into in Waterford, which was the attic of an old workhouse, and there were 3 of us in it at one stage, and it was just piled high with Home Assistance records that had been there from the 1930s. And it was clear nobody ever looked at them. I don't think anybody even knew they were there until we went up. But our great fear was that we were actually going to come down through the ceiling rather than by the way we'd gotten up. We saw a lot of material in basements, particularly in old mental hospitals, which were absolutely, a lot of them very huge buildings. And of course now a lot of the rooms aren't used at all. Sometimes the material from these hospitals were actually in the basement, and in some of the basements there were literally rats or dead rats or whatever, and we did run from the live rats. We actually managed it. There was one place, I'm not sure, I think Leanne, who was one of my co-workers, ran faster than I did up the stairs when we actually saw the live rat. But so, stuff was not in great condition. But one of the things I think that we managed to do was to alert a lot of people that these archives this material was actually very, very important. And at the time as well, the government had set up a local government archives project, and we worked closely with them, and we alerted them to material, local government material that we saw in various places, which didn't have hospitals. The hospitals that we went to see didn't have archivists. We were lucky that the material was actually there. There was nobody looking after it. But one of the things that happened, and I think as a result of the project, that people did consider this material was important and actually did start to take it serious and to move it and to give it, put it into storage where it was kept under better conditions. But one of the groups, I suppose, where we found the most material was, of course, in convent archives. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about convent archives, even though it's a kind of a sensitive subject at the moment because it's relatively difficult now to get into convent archives, particularly if you're doing anything on the 20th century. If you're doing something on the late 18th century or 19th century up to about the 1890s, they can be pretty flexible in allowing you entry. But if you want to see a lot of material after 1900, it's actually very, very difficult. And of course, the richness of convent archives for a study of Irish history has not really been fully realised or recognised by historians. And research, I think, in such archives is not solely a means of examining the lives of nuns, of exploring the internal physical, spiritual and emotional spaces where these women lived out their lives. Through convent archives, we can also study the history of Irish society generally, using a wide variety of techniques and disciplines. In a physical sense, the architecture of convents and their attached institutions reveal the use of space, internal and external, where nuns carried out their lives and managed their charges. Convents, particularly those that had institutions attached, were apparent public buildings, clearly evident on the geographical landscape, but the physical space of these buildings was carefully defined and regulated. For instance, within a convent, the parlour and the chapel mark the boundaries of public access to the convent interior. The place of convents within the physical landscape of Irish towns is significant in terms of mapping the extent of institutional presence in the country. And of course, the extensive nature of foreign missionary activity, again, very hot subject at the moment for a lot of historians, can also be mapped from convent records. Through convent records, we can also uncover the history of health, welfare, and educational institutions of all types in Ireland. We can also, to some extent, examine the lives of individuals who came into contact with religious communities, whether as children or adults, as users of services, as providers of money and funding, as representatives of higher authorities. So the material stored in convent archives holds the history not only of religious congregations, but also of Irish society itself. And this is the line I always use when I talk to nuns about their archives, because I think they underestimate really how valuable they are for Irish history generally. One of the kind of documents you can find in convents are annals, and the annals are usually the history of the community. They're often written at the end of a year by a particular person within the community, and they give the occurrences within the convent or outside of that particular year. And again, depending on whether the annalist likes writing or not, you can get copious annals, or you can just get a very limited sketch of what's actually gone on in the year. One of the interesting things is, again, within convent archives, you have these annals, which all convents have, and you also have what they call good annals. And good annals are the censored annals. So if you ever, and they never tell you this, okay? So if you ever do any research in convents and they give you the annals, always ask if there are other versions of the annals as well. And often they wrote good annals to take out what they called any controversial material that might have been written by an annalist, unwisely by an annalist. And sometimes you find, if there are only one set of annals, that there are pages missing, because it often refers to some controversy or conflict, either with the local bishop or something else that went on wherever the convent is, or internally within the convent, and they don't really want you to know about it. It was a common phrase in every single convent and diocesan archive we went into. The one thing everybody said to us was not to write in our database, and all we were doing was making a list. We weren't analysing, we weren't doing anything, we were making a list, was not to use anything controversial or scandalous, right? And we didn't, because they really, you can certainly find that kind of stuff, and it's there. And if you go looking through the database, you'll find it. But you actually have to go and look at the material itself to see what the controversies were actually about. So convents also, of course, have registers of women who entered the community. And of course, one of the things we know about nuns, particularly up to about the 1860s and 1870s, is that they tended to bring a lot of money with them to convents when they entered. So convents were relatively wealthy institutions. They were also institutions that ran businesses, and you will find instances, for example, of convents owning shares in particular businesses, particularly the railroads was quite a common one where they owned shares, and they tended to reinvest whatever money they got into the community or into the institutions that they ran. As I said, there is a little bit of controversy at the moment about convent archives, particularly their archives that deal with institutions such as industrial schools, reformatory schools, or Magdalen asylums. And basically, there is no access to this material at the moment, but we hope that when all the hullabaloo and dies down, that this material will again become available to historians, but that may not be for another 20 or 30 years, if not longer. So there is an extensive variety of material within convent archives, and I think one of the best and the most interesting ones I came across when we looked at the records of the medical missionaries of Mary, and which had been founded by Mother Mary Martin in April of 1937. And this archive contains 150 boxes of material, and it's made up of correspondence, diaries, minute books, press cuttings, photographs, films, and some tapes. And there are also documents and letters between the different members of the congregation from different communities around the world. One of the really interesting parts of this material is that it includes correspondence between Mary Martin and her mother, dating from 1915 to 1921, when Mary Martin herself worked as a nurse, a voluntary aid detachment nurse, a VAD, V-A-D, in Malta and France during the period of the First World War. And of course the history of Irish women in the First World War still needs to be written, and the papers of Mary Martin will be invaluable when we come to write that history. Recent work on women at the front has raised questions about the power dynamics that existed between soldiers and nurses, and between different groups of women workers at the front, whether they were VADs, army nurses, or relief workers. The war and nursing experience revealed in Martin's letters supports many of the findings of historians on this subject. In January of 1916, for instance, Martin wrote to her mother about various regulations that determined to keep nurses from socialising with their patients. It was a big thing. Nurses were not supposed to socialise with the patients, especially nurses of the class of Mary Martin. And she told her mother about a Christmas party that she and other nurses had actually organised with the men, in hospital, and they were all to meet outside and whatever. And she said the rules were so strict that the nurses couldn't pretend to have anything to do with this party that they had arranged. So what happened was that the wounded men went out of the hospital, were walking down the street, and then the nurses came along afterwards and then pretended to be completely surprised to meet these men, and maybe we should go celebrate Christmas. That was their way around it. And similarly, she talks about the rivalry that existed between VADs and army nurses, which again, from other accounts, was a feature of women's war experiences at the front. And it is evident in Martin's remark that, having observed a group of officers from the hospital ship who had come into the tea shop and started chatting to the VADs, which she noted was against VAD and nurse rules, Martin and her friends left, leaving the other little fools, she said, talking and laughing, and the two army nurses taking it all in. So they were obviously gathering information to be used against these VADs. So huge amount of material, varied material within convent archives. I mean, the other interesting material within the Medical Missionaries of Mary archive is they have the records of the Waterford Lying-in Hospital from 1838 to about 1840, and other records for the hospital from 1833 to 1869. Very, very unusual collection, very difficult to get those kinds of records for lying-in hospitals in Ireland. And they have them because they took over the nursing in the hospital in the mid-20th century, and if they hadn't looked after the records, they would have been thrown out with everything else that was thrown out when the hospital was taken over by them. So, along with convent archives, we also looked at diocesan archives, which are again very, very rich and underutilised source for not just Irish women's history, but Irish history generally. And just to tell you about one collection that we came across in the Dublin Diocesan Archives, and this was in the paper, these were in the papers of Edward J. Byrne, who was ordained Archbishop of Dublin in 1920. And amongst the papers, there's a collection of over 5,000 letters which are known as charity cases. Okay, and these are written by men and women from all over Ireland. And essentially what they are begging letters requesting financial support from the Archbishop. And the majority of the letters written between 1921 and 1939 were actually from women. And many testify to the poverty and hardship of their lives and the precariousness of their families' material existence. And again, absolutely wonderful source if you want to look at the poorer sections of Irish society in the beginning years of the Free State. The interesting thing about these letters is how the women actually construct them. You can see that, okay, they're destitute, they're poverty-stricken, but also some of them are quite clever in the way they word the letters. And often they say things like that things are so bad that, I may have to go to a Protestant charity if you don't give me some money. And they use all these little ruses in order to get money. Now, in order to get money, often a parish priest or some priest had to investigate the case. And if it was thought to be a bona fide case, then the Archbishop actually did give out some money. But you also get women writing in again and again, and you also get the Bishop's secretary writing, we've dealt with this woman before, we've given her money 3 or 4 times, we're not going to give her any more. But there are also heartbreaking cases of real destitution and poverty within those letters. So those, and there's lots of other things within the diocesan archives. In fact, I could keep you here for a couple of days just telling you about the different kinds of stuff you can find all over in these archives, but I have to finish very soon. One of the other things we did was we listed the existing poor law records for every county in Ireland. And this was a pretty mammoth task. And this included minute books, rough minute books, registers, and other kinds of books that the poor law system actually had. So we're talking here about the workhouse system, right? The workhouse system introduced in Ireland in 1838, and of course designed to assist the most destitute members of Irish society. And while these workhouses really evolved into hospitals by the end of the century, they catered for thousands, hundreds of thousands of destitute Irish throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And these records, again, obviously deal with men, they deal with women, and they deal with children. And again, completely underutilised in terms of Irish history generally. And they're an absolute mine of information about destitute women, deviant women, whatever you like to call them, for the 19th and early 20th century. And, there are lots of, particularly in the early minute books, you get lots of stories of women rioting within the workhouses. And we can see their little rebellions against the rules imposed on them by the workhouse officials. For instance, in the Cork workhouse, it was noted, and I quote, that this was about 1860, that the girls paid great attention to their hair, which was arranged with much skill, and never failed to exhibit a brilliant polish produced by kitchen grease, the parings of mutton chops or castor oil. The board guardians, when they heard this, were absolutely outraged at the kind of what they saw as feminine weakness. And the guardians who managed the workhouse ordered the girls to wear very drab grey-brown caps. And of course, what did the girls do? They wore them at a rakish angle, or they refused to wear them at all, or they destroyed the caps. And you get loads of these little vignettes, really, of how ordinary people resisted authority within these institutions in the 19th and early 20th century. You get stories also of women knitting socks using the wool provided by the workhouse, which was supposed to be for the workhouse. And what they do is they leave the workhouse with the socks under their clothes and go sell them for their own benefit. You find during the famine years, women who worked in the kitchen selling bits of food to other inmates, or bartering bits of food to other inmates. And again, these are the kind of things that historians really haven't looked at all. We listed lots of records in private hands. One of the collections that I looked at was the Young Women's Christian Association, which has a building in Bray. And when I went to see it, they showed me all they said, yes, come along, no problem. We've got lots of annual reports and you can have a look at them. So I went along, and they showed me into this lovely room, and they showed me all these printed annual reports, which were absolutely fine. I listed them all, and it took me maybe an hour or so. And so we were having a cup of tea, and I just said, by the way, do you have anything else, or is there any other material here? And she said, well, I don't know. She said, there's some stuff in the cupboard there, but I don't think it'll be of any interest to you. So we went to the cupboard, and the cupboard was about this height. And from here up, there was a water tank, right? And from here down were these collections of minute books, letters, correspondence from all over the world about the YWCA going back to the 1870s. And they were in plastic bags. Some of them were just loose. And I looked at them, and I said, oh my heavens, this is wonderful. And she said, really? She said, would they be of interest to you? And I said, yes. And there was just magnificent material there. There was absolutely a wonderful little diary kept by a clergyman about the training of young women for the missions, and about young women being trained to go out to China and India in the 1880s and 1890s. And he gave little character descriptions of them. So what we managed to actually list those records, and actually got them to put the records into an archive, which is what we managed to do with quite a number of records that we saw, particularly in organisations like that. Another private collection that we came across were the records of the Irish Housewives Association, which was founded in 1942 by Hilda Tweedy, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. And the Irish Housewives Association, sounds very staid and whatever, but in the 1950s it was actually considered to be a front for communism in Ireland. It couldn't be further from communism. But government quite concerned about it in the 1950s. It was actually set up in the context of the emergency of the Second World War in Ireland, very concerned about the welfare of children, about food distribution, about the quality of food that was available to people in Ireland at this time. And what happened was that the Irish Housewives Association actually joined with a number of other women's organisations, like the Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers, which had been set up in 1935, and very, very active. The Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers has been very active in political campaigns and very active in opposing the 1937, of De Valera's 1937 Constitution. So Irish Housewives then, very, very significant organisation. And just, I suppose, to give you a sense of how significant it was, first of all the material was in Hilda Tweedy's house, and when we had it all listed, and it's all now in the National Archives of Ireland, she literally had 2 rooms free in her house. That's how much stuff she actually had. It was an amazing collection. And throughout the decades, from the 1940s, the Irish Housewives Association had been involved in lots of government bodies. It was involved in the Irish Committee, Institute for Industrial Research and Standards and Authority, National Food Quality Assurance, Committee Exchange Information Experience in Family Organisations, Consumer Standards. It was instrumental in establishing the first committee into status of women, and it was just a very, very influential organisation working behind the scenes. And again, it is an organisation that really deserves a history at this stage. A huge, huge collection of papers, and again, very, very influential organisation. Another organisation that we looked at were the Girl Guides, and again we managed to get their papers into the National Archives as well. And of course the Girl Guides were established in Ireland in 1911, and I didn't realise this at all when I started. I thought there was only one kind of group of Girl Guides, so there are actually 3 different organisations of Girl Guides in Ireland. There was a Catholic organisation, Protestant Girl Guides, Catholic Girl Guides, and the Northern Ireland Girl Guides. And we got in touch with the Northern Ireland Girl Guides, and I rang and spoke to the woman in charge, and they actually had their records in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and which means they were available for research, but we just wanted to check, and that was okay, that we would list them on our database. And I never got such a grilling in my whole life as to why an organisation, which was a Women's History Project from the south of Ireland, would be interested in the records of the Northern Ireland Girl Guides. Anyway, we did manage to, it was just, she was just being very, very suspicious about what we were doing. I think she just wasn't sure what this list was actually going to do. So we actually managed to get all of these things listed, and the Girl Guide material listed. And the really interesting thing was that when they started in 1911, one of the things they were very keen to do, of course, was to set up local branches around in counties and whatever. And it was thought that the best way to do this, right, and this, remember, mainly Protestant women at the start involved in it, was to have a chat with the local parish priest. You really needed the permission of the local parish priest before you could set up any Girl Guides organisation. And the advice given from the headquarters in London was that in a locality you sent along your most presentable lady, right? And lady was the highest aristocrat you had available to you in the organisation, and she was to organise a tea for the parish priest, and he would come along, and then you would have a discussion. And it was felt that if you had the genteel lady approaching the parish priest, he was much more likely to give in than if you just had an ordinary middle-class Protestant woman talking to him. Didn't have a great effect, because it took a long time for the Girl Guides to actually get organised in Ireland. They really didn't take off until the 1920s. And they had a humongous dispute in the 1930s when De Valera started changing the name of the Irish Free State to ERA, and they had a huge bus-stop then, and actually a split in the movement about whether their loyalty was to the Commonwealth or to the Irish Free State. And again, there's a wonderful paper, I think, to be written on that. Okay, other stuff we looked at. We looked at lots of papers in the National Library of Ireland. We didn't list them all, it would be impossible. But we managed to get quite a number of them listed. And one of the collections we looked at were the papers of Rosamond Jacob. I'm not sure if people know of Rosamond Jacob, but she was a writer, and she kept diaries, which I know this sounds unbelievable, but she actually started writing a diary in 1897 and stopped in 1960 when she was killed in a motor accident. So her diaries are there in many volumes, and they are a veritable history of Ireland in the 20th century. I mean, absolutely wonderful source of material. One of the things, I mean, not a lot of people know this, but she had an affair with Frank Ryan, the IRA man, and guy who went off to Spain, and she talks about it in her diaries, and it's really very distressing. Frank was obviously used to having affairs that Rosamond wasn't, and they would meet at public functions, and he would not recognise her. He would not pretend to know her, and she found this all very, very distressing. I mean, she didn't have the guts to tell him to, this wasn't really appropriate, and so she writes, and again, very interesting way of writing about this in her diaries. But just to give you two extracts from her diaries. One is from November of 1916, just after the Rising, and she's talking about a meeting she went to. I went out to a Cumann na mBan meeting in Parnell Square, a lot of little Irish classes in a huge hall. I attached myself to the one that Mrs. Cant was teaching and experienced her charm very keenly. Then, as a nurse who was to lecture on first aid failed to appear, a Miss Hoy was put up to describe her experiences in the Rising. And if half of what she said was true, I'd be surprised. She was in the Imperial Hotel and did marvellous tricks on the British soldiers to help her party escape after they were taken. She said the girls of the hotel behaved admirably and kept cooking dinner for the volunteers when the place was practically on fire. Personally, she gave a conceited and rather classy effect. And when I got home and found Mrs. Pearce and Mrs. Clark supping in the kitchen and told them about it, Mrs. Clark said she had been there and didn't believe half of it. Rosamond also went on a visit to Russia between April and May of 1931. She was actually one of two Irish delegates who went as the friends of the Soviet Union. And she writes about her experiences there, and this is one of them. The guide explained that he'd mind us till we would reach the people in Moscow. And insert, hot and sunny, but not a leaf on the trees, women driving trams. Went with the crowd to the Smolny Institute, small plain rooms where Lenin and his wife lived during revolution time, and a big room where Congress was held day after October Revolution. Lenin speaking. We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. Photo of the two men who guarded Lenin's room then, standing at the door. And to St. Isaac's Cathedral, a gorgeous place, now an anti-religious museum, all sorts of pictures of different religions and gods and exposures of priestly worldly doings and bishops blessing a canon, also waxwork prelates in their robes doing an Easter ceremony of feet washing. Also ugly 5-year plan stuff that rather spoilt it. Mrs. Farazin told her husband he ought to take his hat off in church, but he said no, it's been degodded. Again, a colleague of mine in UCD in Dublin and I are hoping to actually publish a full edition of Rosamond Jacobs' diaries, which the Irish Manuscripts Commission are actually keen for us to do, and we're hoping to get that done it'll take us about 2 or 3 years, I think, to do it, because there are over 1 million words there. But I think it'll be a great boon for, again, historians of Ireland, not just of Irish women. We also looked at materials, for example, in the National Botanic Gardens, again, a place where you wouldn't think that they'd be very much by women. But one of the things we came across were these wonderful collections, paintings and drawings of flowers. And the National Botanic Gardens in Ireland have in the region of about 2,000 examples of work done by women. And amongst their collections are the drawings of Lady Charlotte Wheeler Cuff, who had watercolours of native plants in Burma. And there are about 100 of these, and there are also a number of her sketchbooks there as well. There are also watercolours from Lydia Shackleton with about 1,300 orchids, and she had been commissioned by the National Botanic Gardens to actually go and paint these. And there are also diaries of her trips to various countries when doing these kinds of drawings. And again, a resource that nobody has actually used. We also went very much up to date with the material. Indeed, we managed to list the records of the Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition, of course, no longer exists. And their records are, well, they're not actually available for consultation, but at least they're safe, and they will be available in the future. And their records date from 1996 to 98. That's when we saw them. So that was the kind of, that's some of the material that we saw when we were doing that general kind of archival run. And as I said, it took us 2 years. And one of the things I learned, because we stayed in all kinds of places all around the country, we tend to do it individually, and this would have been in the 1998, 99, 2000, and all we knew was that there were an awful lot of hotels in Ireland that none of us would ever want to stay in again, and I just hope the quality has improved since then. But the other thing that was very interesting, particularly by about 2001, was, and this is going from 1997 to 2001, again going back to some of the places to check things, was how much better towns looked in Ireland by the end of the 1990s, the way they were painted, the way buildings were painted, renovations had been done, and you can tell. I mean, I left Ireland in 1990, and which is when the boom started, Ireland has just completely, had been completely transformed, even in the way streets looked and houses looked in all parts of Ireland, not just Dublin, but rural Ireland as well. It was quite extraordinary. One of the other things we did was we examined some of the papers in the National Archives, and we focused here on the papers of the Department of the Taoiseach. And in doing this, we basically concentrated on the years between 1922 and 1966, and there were just under 2,000 boxes of material. And what we did with this was we went through every file, every single piece of paper in those 2,000 boxes, and if there was a mention of a woman anywhere, we put it onto a database. And what we did also was synopsize or use extracts from the relevant documents and put that onto the database as well. And on the database, there's something in the region of about 20,000 pieces of information relating to women in 20th century Ireland, and this comes from just one set of papers in the National Archives. And if anybody's interested in looking at these databases, all you need to do is go to the National Archives of Ireland website and look up databases. We're there. It's under women's history. And the files in the Department of the Taoiseach cover every aspect of Irish life in the 20th century. Some of the files relate to the drafting and enactment of and reaction to legislation, particularly things like the 1937 Constitution. And again, people forget that there was, even though it was a very small group of women, there was a vociferous opposition amongst a certain group of women to the 1937 Constitution. There are also, of course, lots of files which chronicle the development of government policy on many, many issues, and many of these relate to women. There are files which contain memorandums submitted to Cabinet, there are reports of public bodies and commissions, as well as communications from a variety of organisations and individuals. And the files include considerable information relevant to the study of the political and social and economic position of women in Ireland since 1922. For instance, there are files on women's opposition to the Civil Service Amendment Act of 1925. The files also contain fascinating material from the post-Civil War period on women activists and on women prisoners. And it is already, this site is already, and this material is already being used to rewrite, or even write for the first time, I suppose, the history of women in 20th century Ireland. I'll just give you two small examples from that collection. And this is a file on the Dublin Film Society, and it's dated February 1930, and it's marked strictly confidential. And it's a letter stating that the Dublin Film Society is promoted by persons who consider themselves intellectuals. The writer mentions, amongst others, Miss Manning, of course some of her papers here in the Burns Library as well, a journalist in the film and fashion area. However, the writer states that their programme is disturbing. We have some reason to fear, and this fear is not dictated by reference to the personnel of the society, that Bolshevist propaganda agents look to the society as a medium for the dissemination of films which would otherwise fail to secure publicity here. And of course, everybody's scared of communism in the 1930s, and Ireland no less so than many other European countries. In another file, which is a file, huge file, called Anti-State Activities, and it's dated between April 1929 and October 1931. And in this file, it's, as I said, it's an absolutely huge file. There are police notes on many what we would call radical organisations that existed in Ireland at this time. And the beginning of the document, of the file, it says, the following notes have been compiled with a view to showing that the extremist movement in this country is a strange mixture of political revolutionaries and social revolutionaries. There will be found in the same organisation intellectuals living on the dividends of the capitalist system and corner boys who have no other driving force behind them than discontent with their condition in life. It is also of interest to note that much the same people appear to be behind several organisations, Mrs. Maud Gonne McBride being as ubiquitous as it is possible to be. And it's amazing how many of the files actually do deal with Maud Gonne. She is everywhere, even in the early 20th century. So those were, again, teeny example out of 20,000 of the kind of material that can be found in the Taoiseach's papers. And I just want to tell you very briefly then, before I finish, about another collection of papers that has come to light since we finished our project. And again, this is a collection, I think, that will have a huge impact on how we look at nationalist history in Ireland. And these are the papers of the Bureau of Military History. Now, the Bureau of Military History was established in January of 1947, and it was to collect material, and notice the dates, dating between the 25th of November 1913, when the Irish Volunteers were established, to the 11th of July 1921, which is the signing of the truce. It wasn't to go into the Civil War period. Okay? A lot of people didn't actually cooperate with the Bureau when they were collecting their material. Interestingly enough, De Valera actually never... and this is people talking about their participation in events between 1913 and 1921 are 2 pages long. Some of them are 200 pages long. So there's a huge variety and difference between the statements given. Out of this 1,770 statements, there are 149 statements from women. Right? They didn't kill themselves looking for women, actually, to give evidence. But at least that material is there. And even these 149 statements really indicate the wide-ranging nature of women's involvement in the movement for independence. And again, just to give you 2 examples, this is a photocopy of a witness statement by a woman called Margaret Keogh, whose own name was Quinn, and she actually lived in Long Island in New York, and she was interviewed for this. And she was a treasurer of Ineen na hÉireann and a member of Cumann na mBan. And one of the things I'm interested in, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is the history of prostitution in Ireland between 1800 and 1940. And of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, groups like Cumann na mBan and Ineen na hÉireann and women nationalist activists were very keen to ensure that Irish girls did not date British soldiers. Okay, and she talks a little bit about this in her statement, which is one of the reasons I have a copy of it. And she said, "We used to go into the public houses with our anti-recruiting leaflets and have things thrown at us and very vile language sometimes. We tried to get the soldiers off the streets. We did not succeed fully in this. We got them, however, confined to certain areas. They could only walk at one side of O'Connell Street." This is actually true. The soldiers were supposed to only walk down the post office side, which I think is kind of ironic, of O'Connell Street. And then what they did was, our main object was to save the young Irish girls from falling into their hands. A decent girl could not walk down the post office side without being molested. Then such girls got the name of a soldier's totty. And the interesting thing in the Clark papers that are here, I was just looking very briefly the other day. John Attenbury is very kindly showing me the papers, and there's actually a leaflet in the papers, in the Clark papers from 1910, which is exactly this, about telling Irish girls not to go with soldiers. So it's wonderful. In this as well, there's a statement from Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who was a member of the Irish Citizens Army, and she talks about, in her statement, she talks about her time in Mountjoy Prison. She says, "We were handled rather with joy by the wardresses because we were interesting prisoners. We were not like ordinary criminals. I got quite fond of the wardress who looked after me. She was quite kindly. We discovered that when the suffragettes were there, they had made little holes in the plaster under the pipes so that if one lay down on the floor, one could talk to the person in the next cell. Countess Plunkett was in the next cell to mine. Of course, she was in a terrible state about her son having been executed, and she used to get awfully lonely and upset at night. We would lie down on the floor and talk, and that would make her better. After a while, we were allowed visitors and parcels, and then we were inundated with all sorts of presents of luxuries. The only thing we longed for was clean bread and butter. We had all sorts of cakes and fruits, etc., but we wanted something plain." And that was an extract from her relatively short statement, actually, to the Bureau of Military History. So in other words, when we finished our project, we actually were quite astonished by the amount of material that we had come across. I suppose it exceeded all our expectations. The variety, the richness, the quality, and the quantity of information within Irish archives is absolutely astonishing. We had, for instance, looked at and listed the archives of convents, county councils, psychiatric hospitals, libraries, museums, and public and private institutions and organisations. We listed all known poor law records. What became so obvious from our survey was that women were to be found in almost all official public and private documents. They were spoken of in institutional records such as the minutes of a poor law board or the committal forms of a 19th century lunatic asylum. They recorded the functionings of their convents, institutions, and landed estates and businesses in finance ledgers, reports, and correspondence. They were affected by the financial constraints imposed by local authorities, such as county councils. They were tenants whose payments were noted in thousands of rentals. They were voters. People tend to forget that Irish women could vote for poor law guardians from 1838. And they did. And in fact, there's a wonderful a notice about the Sisters of Charity in Dublin. They had a community, and the poor law election was coming up, and they wrote to the poor law commissioners and asked, could they have an individual vote? Because they actually wanted to have some say in who actually got elected. And by having an individual vote for everybody in the convent, in the community, they would have been able to exert enormous power on who was selected, but they weren't. They were only allowed to have one vote, which they were very disappointed by. So if you think nuns in the 1860s weren't political, they actually were. There was some politics there. Women also recorded their personal lives in letters, diaries, journals, and commonplace books. They painted, they stitched, they embroidered, they wrote music, plays, poems, and novels. All of these sources are available for a study of the history of women in Ireland. And just before I finish, I came across this. I just love this letter, an extract from a letter that I came across in Monaghan County Museum. And they're part of a collection called the Moorhead Collection. And it turns out that these ladies were actually related to, as some of you might know, Hubert Butler, who was a very famous essayist. And this is a letter, and just think of this, context of this, right? 1851, famine, finishing the worst of the famine over, okay? And I think this is so much about life and about, I suppose, really how wonderful it is to have the job of a historian, to find documents like this. And it is a description of a servant's ball. And it's in a letter from one woman to her sister. Her servant has given her the story. And it's called, the letter, on the top of the letter is High Life Below Stairs. The cook, a man cook, opened the ball, and Mary, during the evening, got in with a very pleasant party in the scullery. And again, any of you who have ever been students can imagine the kind of party this. You get stuck in the kitchen. And she had great fun, and a very nice man paid her great attention, and somebody told him they would tell his wife. And Mary talked to everybody there by her own account. And every place was covered with holly and ivy, art ivy, harps and crowns, and Éireann go Bragh in large letters on a sheet. And the musicians were seated on the dresser, and there were 3 supper tables, and all sorts of beef and fowl. And such life after the devastation of the famine. I just think it's such a wonderful vignette of life in a tiny little house in Monaghan in 1851. And I think one of the things that our project proved, even though it hasn't really made any great impact for many male historians of Irish history, is that there are more than enough materials out there to write about Irish women's history. And we can no longer have the excuse that the sources aren't there. Thank you. Thank you. Do people want to ask questions?
Yes. We have time for a few questions. Any questions?
Yes.
You said that you could not get access to records in religious communities in the 20th century. Were there any religious communities who did not have an institution attached to them, let's say cloisters or whatever?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And could you get access to
Yes. Yeah. Presentation community, for instance, didn't run institutions as such, and you can get access to their material. So there are a lot of communities, the smaller ones, where you can actually get access to material. There was one I was very, very keen to get access to. I did actually go and see their archive. It was a French congregation that was based in Dublin, and in the 19th century they ran a private lunatic asylum, and they have all the records. They won't let anybody see them, which is a great shame, because I'm sure it'd be absolutely wonderful resource. But no, there are a number of communities, particularly the ones involved in education alone, that ran secondary schools and whatever. The Dominicans, they will allow you access to their material. Yeah, yes, they do. Yeah, it's the larger congregations like the Mercy, which is of course one of the largest. It is the largest female religious congregation in the world, actually, which is. And has absolutely magnificent archives, which is very wary of letting anybody see anything from the 20th century. Good Shepherd as well, yeah. Kevin, yeah.
I was wondering to what extent women's history has been integrated or at least introduced into the curriculum at secondary or college level. I guess I know the answer.
Yeah, very sore question. Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of in the United States in the 70s when a lot of reconstructed women's history was written, and there was a big surge in historiography. The question then was what impact that would have on college level teaching, and the sort of the joke was that what happened was the small men was included, then you add women and stern.
Yeah.
The same way. And a variation on that is that the college syllabus will have the lecture on women's history in February, or textbooks will have. Textbooks are better, I think. Textbooks are distributed in something, but I wonder,
Yeah.
A, where we are, and maybe B, yes.
Where we are, it's actually quite disheartening, I think, considering the amount of work that has been done on women's history in Ireland, and also the amount of material that is there to research. The Department of Education has just introduced a new history curriculum for secondary schools, and I think there are about 3 women represented in that. You have Maud Gaughan, Mark is mentioned, Hannah Shees, Kevin, Nano Nagle, that's it. And when they were putting that curriculum together, they actually called for people, interested groups and whatever, to write in. And the Women's History Association of Ireland, which I'm involved in, we made a very large submission, gave them examples of the kind of women where they could get information, all this kind of thing. And none of it had any impact. They did acknowledge and said it had been very helpful, but it doesn't turn up in the material. The only, I suppose, good thing in terms of secondary schools is that the Department of Education did fund a project on women's history for intermediate years. That's between doing junior cert and leaving cert. Some students take a year out there, and they put together a website which you can only get access to if you're a student, if you're in school or whatever. And it's actually very, very good. It's actually a very good piece of work. So that's it at secondary level. At third level, one would despair. It's not even, I think, people, okay, you might be lucky to get the odd lecture in women's history. As far as I'm aware, there's only one course in any Southern Irish university that is a course in Irish women's history. Mary O'Dowd in Queen's in Belfast runs the only MA in Irish women's history in the country. And you have to think of that, I suppose, as British history. And that's about it. Yeah, there are a number of women historians who write on women, who do teach in Irish universities, not very many. And I know they do introduce bits and pieces in their classes, but generally no. It is actually quite disappointing. And interestingly enough, Irish women's history sells really, really well. There seems to be very strong public appetite for it. Now, the quality of a lot of the stuff that comes out isn't great, which is, again, something I think that we need to be very careful of. But it's certainly popular, yeah, and does sell. And publishers don't seem to have any problem with actually, commissioning people to write histories of Irish women. And this year, there's General History of Women in 20th Century Ireland, literally published about 2 weeks ago. There's another one coming out early next year, another one, again, coming out at the end of next year. So 3 general histories on women in 20th century Ireland in the space of a year. and they think there's an audience. Yes.
If you've had a chance to look at the latest edition of the Directory of Irish Archives by Seamus and Lehman, how well does that represent women's history?
It does all it does a lot of the convents, not all the convents. It actually does when we finished our directory, and one of the things we did was we sent all the material back to the various groups or repositories so that to be absolutely sure that what we were putting on our database was correct. And all of this was to go to our web person on the Monday, and on Friday about 40 or 50 convents sent back. I'm sure this was concerted effort, saying they did not want the material on the web, and so we had to leave all of those out, even though we'd done hundreds and hundreds of convents. And I noticed that in the directory they have the ones in that we have in as well, so they haven't gotten anywhere with the ones that don't allow access. I think the interesting thing about looking at sources like a guide for archives is ours was particular and peculiar in that it focused on women. And indeed, anybody could use this directory because it's not just about women's history, it's about Irish history. I mean, it's just because you look at a particular source and it relates to women doesn't mean you can't get other things out of it. The problem with a lot of guidebooks and whatever is that they give you general accounts and descriptions of material, but they don't tell you what's there about women. And this is where ours, I think, actually does help. I mean, one of the things that, a lot of people over the years have destroyed material relating to women's groups and organisations because they think it's of no value. And we've come across material, or at least been told about material, suffrage material, the early 20th century, that some of it found, one person I know who found it on a skip, a minute book of Anna Haslam's Suffrage Society. And that's the only volume that was saved. And women's history stuff seems to get thrown out much more easily than other organisations. And I think people just aren't aware, at least certainly in Ireland, and I hope we had some impact. They just weren't aware. A lot of places we went to, as I said, didn't realise they even had material on women. A lot of diocesan archives would wrote back and say, why would we have anything on women? This is about clerics and whatever. It's also about nuns. It's also about ordinary people. Everything is in diocesan archives. So a huge amount of material in there on women. And even things like, I'm just looking at Eli there, the Land League. I mean, you've got a whole collection of Land League papers in the National Archives. And when we went to look, you wouldn't realise that there was very much there in women. But there's a huge collection in there on the Ladies' Land League. And we pointed that out. And, it's by doing that kind of thing that you actually make the records available, I think, to people. I think you actually have to specify. Otherwise, it's going back to the same thing. There isn't anything there. How can you possibly research it? It just doesn't exist. And I think our project proved, well, actually does exist. And it's there, there are copious amounts of material there for the study of women in Ireland.
That's a big topic. I was sort of thinking some digitized robotic age that could be accomplished. But the one that was part of that I was interested in was you mentioned you were able to get information on servants.
Yes.
It's very thorough. I found to do at this end. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. If you had any pointers on how one might do the same on this side of the Atlantic.
Well, a project like this.
Just where to look. I mean, in other words, what types of sources did you find and might you find them?
Well, certainly with servants, you're talking landed estates. Yeah, you're going to get a lot of information there on servants. The correspondence, the Drennan McTeer correspondence, because they were so dependent on servants, it's just the place, the correspondence is actually full of their dealings with their servants and whatever, and the troubles they had with them. And a lot of the letters between ladies and whatever in the 19th century, and the correspondence, they actually do cover servants. You have to look, you have to troll, but the stuff is there. How would you do it here? I don't know. I think if you actually set about it, if you're looking for Irish domestic servants, I think, again, you're talking about going to the cities, first of all, where Irish women actually well, wherever they immigrated and then migrated to within the States. And then I think you're talking census records and looking at those as a start, and then finding those, and then trying to discover if there's family correspondence, not necessarily from the Irish person, but maybe even from the household, within the household. I mean, that would be one way, I think, of doing it. It would be, I think, again, it would be a long way around, but I think that would be one of the only ways, really, of starting a project like this. I think the other thing I should mention, too, and historians tend to be wary of technology, but I think if we hadn't websites, if we hadn't computers, a project like this would have actually been impossible. And I think that we just need to use computers, we need to use technology, we need to use databases of all kinds. We need to use all kinds of software packages to actually, not to actually give us the answer to whatever problems we pose in terms of history, but to be able to make connections and to find material, and to just be able to utilize technology to do that kind of work. And I think the ideal thing is to have all of this material digitized and up on the web and available to anybody and everybody who actually wants to study it, to have the original documents there. I think it would be just wonderful. But that's never going to happen, not in my lifetime anyway. Maybe in a couple of 100 years' time it might happen. But I think it would be an absolutely marvellous thing to have.
Well, thank you very much.